Friends, good afternoon. For those of you I don't know, my name is David Hope-Jones. I'm the Chief Executive of the Scotland-Malawi Partnership, and welcome to this, the 6th in our series of 8 governance webinars. This is an exciting one. Well, they're all exciting, but this one's particularly exciting because it's the first in our, as we migrate from single speakers to panel discussions. And we have 3 fantastic Malawian speakers today and a brilliant Scottish respondent. I think today's meeting is even more international than our previous ones, because we have not only, of course, speakers in Malawi and Scotland, but in Cape Town, and I think Susan's in her van in Spain as well. So no, really thrilled that you can join us. This webinar series is all about a fantastic new book, Beyond Impunity, New Directions for Governance in Malawi. It's been written by 25 leading Malawian academics on this subject, and it's been expertly co-edited by Ken Ross, Asiati Chiweza, and Wapu Mulwafu. And one of the great things about having 3 co-editors of a great volume such as this is when you do webinars, two can be called into other meetings at short notice, and you've still got one left. And it's in that spirit that Wapu is, I think, having to invigilate, and Asiati as well today. But we're absolutely thrilled to have, of course, a great friend of the partnership, Professor Kenneth Ross, who's going to chair us today. We have, I think, 90 minutes in the diary today, and we'll see how much of that we want to use. Please do think of questions you want to ask as our speakers are speaking, and Ken will guide you through that process. But without any further delay, let me hand over to our chair for this afternoon, Professor Kenneth Ross. Over to you, Ken.
Well, thank you very much, David, and thank you to Scotland-Malawi Partnership and Malawi-Scotland Partnership for co-hosting our event today. Looking around the room, I can see quite a number of seasoned participants in this webinar, so I think it makes my task a little bit lighter in introducing it. But in case there may be 1 or 2 who are just stepping in for the first time, the purpose of the webinar is to give a pre-publication airing to a book that we hope is going to be a significant contribution to understanding and discussion of governance in Malawi. And the thing that is a little bit exciting for me today, I know especially those of us in Malawi, we've been impatiently waiting for the publication, and we're still waiting, but I do have in my hand a pre-publication copy of the Malawi print of the book. So this is being printed in Lilongwe as I speak, and we hope it's going to be available very soon. So those of us who've been waiting for that moment, I hope it's not very much longer before the much talked about book is a reality. And also next month, it'll be going into print also in South Africa with the University of Cape Town Press. And already we do have the print on demand available in Oxford with the African Books Collective. So the book is step by step making its way into reality. But it's been really exciting for us. I think all of the contributors to the book who've participated so far, they found it a great experience to be in the webinar, because when you publish an article or a chapter, you often get very little response, or if you get a book review, it comes maybe a year or 2 later. But this kind of instant response, where you've prepared a chapter and then a group of peers and friends hear what you have to say and respond to it immediately, that's been very stimulating for all the authors so far, and I hope it'll be no exception today. I would encourage you, just as we're getting going, to use the chat function just to to say a friendly hello or introduce yourself, and it just creates a little community as we go along. So if you're familiar with using chat in Zoom, please feel very welcome just to drop a friendly word or two as we come together. So as David said, we're switching format a little bit today. So it's more like a panel presentation, and we're going to have three successive presentations. And I think this is very good because it kind of captures the nature of the book, because what the book seeks to do is to analyze governance in Malawi from many different angles of analysis. And we hope that brings a texture and a depth and a richness to what we're doing. And so if you just present one at a time, you don't quite get the flavor of that. So I think having three presentations in quick succession, it'll give us a good taster of the book. And then, as has been the pattern throughout the series, we will have a Scottish response that'll reflect on what we're hearing from Malawi, and perhaps even make some cross-reference to the kind of experiences there have been in Scotland. But let me not take up too much time with the introductions. The first chapter that's going to be presented by Martin Limbikani Mwale is a chapter that we're really delighted to be able to have in the volume, because we thought it brought quite an original angle of analysis and some original data to support it. So it's a chapter on trust in election management bodies, participation in demonstrations, and willingness to pay taxes, evidence from Malawi. And there's a formidable team that put this chapter together, with Martin himself, also Gowokani Chijere Chirwa, Tony Mwenda Kamninga, and Laston Petro Manja. But the presentation is made by Martin Mwale himself, final year PhD candidate at the University of Stellenbosch in South Africa, having already graduated Master of Commerce and Economics at the same school. And Martin's interests are in development economics and spatial econometrics welfare analysis. And currently, he's looking at the effects of the Malawi Farm Input Subsidy Program on women and children. But Martin, I know today you're going to have a laser focus on the question of trust in election management bodies. So over to you to get our webinar well underway. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Prof, for the wonderful introductions, and thank you everyone for coming to listen to our presentation and the other presentation proceeding in this session. So as rightly introduced by Prof, we were looking at trust in election management bodies and participation in demonstrations and willingness to pay taxes using the data from Malawi, as that is known. And that's the list of people who were involved in writing this paper: myself, Martin, and then Gogani, Tony, and Laston Manja. Okay, are we able to see the screen share?
Yeah, it's very good for me, Martin. I hope everyone else too.
Yep, working well.
All right, okay. Yes, so the issue of elections integrity, which is we are coining it as trust in election management bodies, was the center stage for the conceptualization of this paper. So generally, elections integrity has got institutional consequences. In most instances, it's voter turnout. when the people who are voting observe that their votes have often previously not been handled in a free or fair manner, which doesn't represent their opinions through the vote, mostly there's voter turnout. Like in the succeeding elections, some people get discouraged to vote. And then in some senses, even if when they don't vote, or even when they vote, but if they don't trust the credibility of the election management system, sometimes they may not support the state which comes into power after those kind of elections. So that's an issue of state legitimacy. Having these concepts well established in the democratic governance literature, but there's still something which needs to be talked about. The elections integrity could also induce dire behavior responses. Much as we know that voter turnout can happen and state legitimacy might result, there's also need to understand what kind of behavior responses could follow, and which is mostly not given much attention. So studies on the relationship between the credibility of election management bodies and the behavior responses of voters what are scarce, and that's what motivated this paper. So we aimed to explore the impacts of people's trust in election management bodies, on particularly how the trust relates to participation in demonstrations and the willingness to pay taxes. The study context, it's in Malawi. I'll just give a brief of some history related to this topic. In Malawi, there are two fierce demonstrations which took place. One was in 2011, which was about mostly the main flagged issues, fuel and forex shortages. And then another one was another bigger demonstration was in 2019, the most recent one, where it was observed irregularities in the election management of the 2019 general elections. Having this in the history as one of the most fierce demonstrations in the country. And then we took a step back and tried to see, well, how about tax administration? In terms of tax administration, generally Malawi is an informal country. Even its tax system, it collects less revenue on corporate taxes. Most of the country is now dependent on value-added taxes, where they know they can reach out to most people. And then there's also some section of the population which is paying payee, those are the employed, but these are also less people. So as the economy is mostly informal based, it means even the collection, the tax mobilization is not an easy task. When formality is increasing, it becomes easy to pin down most, especially small businesses. But in an environment where most businesses are not registered, like the setup of Malawi, in most instances, it will depend on the people's willingness to pay taxes. And mostly this will come from their understanding of what exactly their money does in the development of the country or the development of their lives per se. And the issue of electoral integrity, there are also two important points in the Malawian history. In 1999, there were elections which were highly contested, as the public perceived as if the elections were not free and fair from the majority public opinion. The issue was taken to court. In the court, the incumbent won. That was Bagiri moves against Gwanda Chawamba, the two contestants, the two top contestants of that particular time. In 2019, there was a repeat of what happened in 1999. Elections were contested with issues of mild irregularities, the most recent case. In this case, unlike the previous, the incumbent did not succeed in court. So these are two scenarios which look similar, but they had different outcomes. So this also makes the story of examining the elections integrity, in the integrity of election bodies and trust, that is trust in these bodies and their impacts on demonstration, willingness to participate in demonstrations and tax administration important. The most interesting thing about this paper is the data that we used in this paper comes before the 2019 demonstration protests and the outcomes of the elections and everything. But as we shall see at the end of the papers, I'll be presenting the results. What data predicted before it happened is exactly what happened. So we are using data from 2018 going downwards. But then what we are seeing is what the data talked about in those years is exactly what manifested in 2019, which means these issues of the relationship between the trust in the election management bodies and demonstration protests, as well as tax mobilization, they need adequate attention. So we are using data from Afrobarometer survey collected in 2012, 2014, and 2018. Like, we do 3 series of analysis to make sure that all the results we are trying to see the patterns of the results we are finding in the study across different data sets at different points in time in the same country, using the same instruments used for collecting the data, the Afrobarometer. Our outcome variables are demonstration participation, whether one would never participate in a demonstration, or one would once or twice, or several times, or oftentimes. A payment of taxes, the variables coded as, so one never refuses to pay taxes, one would refuse given a chance, one refused once or twice, one refused several times, and then the last option is whether one always refuses or often refuses. We also controlled for the characteristics of the respondents in the survey, that is age, gender, employment status, religion, education, location, corruption, for general levels of corruption in the country, the public services access, and government performance for all the respective years of the data that we used. The empirical strategy, we used an ordered probability models, and then we extracted marginal effects from the ordered probability to be able to interpret the results as probabilities or percentage changes. And then the omitted categories for our outcome variables were someone who never participated in a demonstration and someone who never refuses to pay tax. So the results, what we find is that when one has somewhat or a lot of trust in the elections management bodies, or relative to no trust at all, when one trusts the elections management body, or no trust at all, what we are seeing is there's a 15% reduction in participation in demonstration in 2018. That is, people who trust the election management bodies so much, there's a 15% chance that they will not participate in demonstrations in 2018. Okay, just to also to shed light is to say, I didn't clarify, but then the trust in, the trust in the election management bodies, they may be coded by different names in different countries, but in Malawi, it's the Malawi Electoral Commission. So the question was asked like, trust in the Malawi Electoral Commission. So we're seeing that when there's a lot of trust in Malawi Electoral Commissions, people are willing to reduce their probability to participate in demonstration by 15%. And in 2014, we are finding an 18% reduction in demonstration participation. While in 2012, there was a 10% reduction in demonstration participation. So as trust for the electoral management body is increasing, people are becoming less and less willing to participate in demonstrations. In other ways, they are becoming more satisfied with the outcomes of the elections, and they see no need to demonstrate in protest of the results. Now, the same trust in elections management bodies, in this case, they increased trust in the Malawi Electoral Commission. In 2018, it increased the probability, or it increased the probability of paying taxes by 16%. While in 2014, it increased the probability of paying taxes in 12%. In 2004, there was literally no relationship. We find no relationship between having trust in the Malawi Electoral Commission and willingness to pay taxes. So as we can see that, interestingly, like for the willingness to pay taxes, in the earlier days, people were not so critical of what the taxes are doing. But as of 2012, they didn't really, what the electoral management system was doing didn't really bring to mind for them to be critical about paying taxes. But with time, there's always an increased awareness of the implications of their taxes and the outcomes of elections. And the percentage is increasing with time. Similarly, even participation in demonstrations, in 2012, it's the lowest relationship between trust in the Malawi Electoral Commission and participation in demonstrations. So what these two sets of results are saying that over time, people are becoming more and more aware of the implications of the results of their elections. So more likely, they are changing behaviors. And so in this sense, democratic governance or governance should not be separated from economic development. Otherwise, if we pursue one and leave the other, we may miss the point. Because I mean, the democratic governance should be in the end aiming at improving the welfare of the people. So if there's a disconnect, we'll be leaving these implications running underground, but which are doing damage to the welfare of the country as a whole. So governance, as I was highlighting, governance and development should not be pursued in isolation, because as we see in this paper, they are connected, and the implications is they receive feedback and affect one another in the process. Dissatisfied electorate, they are willing to demonstrate, and they are unwilling to pay taxes. In other words, they don't want to pay taxes to a government they don't see as legitimate due to the outcomes of how it got into power. In 2019 general elections, Malawian courts announced election results. But as we are saying, the data we are using in this paper is in the previous years, 2018 and below. But in 2019, the courts announced the results, and the Electorate ordered the resignation of the Malawi Electoral Commission's chair in the rerun, which was like a sign of mistrust for the elections governing system, which facilitated the 2019 general elections. But our data predicted the demonstrations, even though we are doing it now, but we're using data which come before these elections. And our data said that once people don't trust the Electoral Commission, they'll go for demonstrations, and they'll not be willing to pay taxes. And this is data from years before, and we are seeing it in reality it happened in 2019. So, because we know about demonstrations, and we have linked them to the trust in the electoral management bodies, we should watch out for the tax evasion. That is less talked about because it hasn't received attention at all. But this is what might be going on in the background, which needs attention. Then we conclude that credible electoral management systems could support development through state stability that's avoiding demonstrations or reducing their occurrences, and enhancing public finance. If people trust that this government entered into power legitimately, they may be more willing to pay taxes to it. So increasing the credibility of the electoral commissions will assist in state stability, avoiding demonstrations and distractions, and it will enhance public financing through increased willingness to pay taxes. So what do we have to say for the policymakers? It's important to strengthen the credibility of electoral commissions. And especially in the periods after elections, we should, the policymakers should watch out on remedies to tax evasion, especially around those periods. Yeah, thank you very much.
No, thank you very much indeed, Martin. Such a succinct and clear presentation. I must confess, I was looking a little bit enviously at the wonderful picture you had of the demonstrations, because we were looking for a picture like this for the front of the book, and I think the one we have is quite good, but maybe yours is even better. The only good thing with ours, you see, it's got the Chisanko Cha Tipex Takana banner, which means we refuse to accept the results of the Tipex election. But your picture was also very evocative of those eventful days. But the analysis obviously is the important thing, and you've given us a lot to reflect on. What I would encourage participants to do once you've reflected on Martin's presentation. If you have a question that you'd like to address to Martin, please drop it into the chat while it's fresh in your mind, because when we've had all the presentations, we'll have a time for Q&A, and the questions can be directed to any of the presenters. So if you like to put a question in the chat, then it'll also give Martin a chance to see it, and he'll be well prepared to respond when the time comes. But we're moving rapidly on to our next presentation. Last time we were together in this webinar, we had a broad analysis of the question of violence during elections in Malawi from Professor Edge Kanyongolo. And in one sense, the next chapter we're looking at takes up this theme, but with a more specific focus on violence against women in elections in Malawi, and the role of women leaders as game changers. And just like the previous chapter, this one was a team collaboration, this time with three authors working together: Anthony Jackson Malunga, Ngcimezile Mbano-Mweso, and Bernadette Wangisa Malunga. And we're very grateful that Ngcime is with us today on behalf of our colleagues to tell us about the chapter. So Ngcimezile Mbano-Mweso is a senior lecturer in the Faculty of Law at the University of Malawi, with an LLD from the University of the Western Cape, an LLM in Human Rights and Democratization in Africa from the University of Pretoria, and an LLB Honours from the University of Malawi, where she teaches and researches gender, governance, and environmental law, and also is the coordinator of the Gender Justice Clinic, a platform for students' training, advocacy, research, and legal services. So we could not have a better qualified person to explain this chapter to us. So over to you, and Ngcime, most welcome.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to present. I hope the presentation can be seen. Let me just put it on the...
Yeah, it looks fine. Ngcime, it's looking good.
All right, as already said, this is the paper that was co-authored. I'm presenting it, but it was co-authored indeed by myself and Dr. Malunga, Anthony, and Dr. Malunga, Bernadette. And the title of our paper was Violence Against Women in Elections in Malawi, the Role of Women Leaders as Game Changers. And we set out to look at different categories of women leaders and how they had responded to the violence against women, and whether through their response we could constitute them as game changers. I will define what we used as the basis of saying who's a game changer, but we did look at three categories of women: political leaders, so women in political leadership, member of parliament, and the part of the executive, a minister, and a home ministry. We constituted those. And then we looked at civil society women leaders. We also looked at three non-governmental organizations, and then we looked at constitutional bodies. This was Ombudsman and Malawi Human Rights Commission. So, okay, there's a bit of a delay in the presentation. Yeah. All right. When we talk about violence against women in elections, we define it by looking at, first of all, that it is very much rooted in an equal power between men and women, and it also reinforces the gender hierarchies. And this is seen mostly because it has very specific 3 elements that we can identify when we talk about violence against women. And the violence against women is part of the broader political violence, but it's very specific to women. And these are the 3 elements that one can identify. First of all, that it is towards women in politics, and it is targeting them because they are women. So you can even see that it's not just about women in politics, but it's also targeting them because they're women. And you can see the type of violence that is targeting them is also different from the type of violence that would target a man in politics, as we will see. And then the ultimate goal, which is another element of violence against women in elections, is that it's to deter them from participation. And so we've got, whether it's a candidate at home, where they're being discouraged from taking up politics, it can be through violence, gender-based violence. It can be in private spaces, individuals taking up and trying to prevent them from taking up a position or standing in a position, or it can be in public spheres. And this kind of violence is distinguished in the sense that it is targeting the particular individual because they're a woman, and the type of violence is also very much gendered, and the ultimate goal is to pursue that they stop whatever position that they are pursuing. And we had this in Malawi a lot, and it thrived for months due to street protests that were happening, and we will look at this as well in detail subsequently. When we talk about the concept of game changers, so when we talk about game changers, we're looking at individuals, but also organizations. We focused on individuals and all organizations, but it could also be structured determinants, so events. But we didn't look at that specifically, although the social actors and the organizations could facilitate certain events that would help. So we're looking at social actors or organizations that are exercising agency, and the agency is ultimately to contribute to solving a particular problem, whether it's offering, contributing to an alternative narrative to what is happening, whether it's contributing to change in the practices, but it is that someone has an opportunity and they take up that opportunity to make a difference, whether through their position or through what they do or what they say. And the specific things that have been established looking at feminist writings about game changers, especially in response to violence against women in elections, I think there are about 5 things that can be said. So the first one is naming it as a problem. In order for someone to be a game changer, whatever it is that they're looking at has to be named as a problem. That has to be recognized. So there's something about naming a problem because it brings it out as now highlighting it and calling it for what it is. And then the second one is mapping its manifestation. So this is very particular to violence against women in elections. There'll be different incidents. Sometimes it will look as if it's isolated, but sometimes it's a pattern that is being, targeting the women, targeting, it's very gendered, and it's also a way of preventing them or making sure that they don't get the support that they need. Another thing is raising awareness. And the final thing is devising interventions. So if there is a problem, you've named it, you have evidence of it happening, and you can show and you can follow up. And then you also raise awareness about why it's wrong and what needs to be done. Then you must also take up action. Whatever action it is, it's an intervention that you're trying to contribute to bring about change or to facilitate an alternative narrative or practices that would respond to it. And so we were using these 4, not 5, aspects in trying to see what was happening when violence was happening in Malawi. And in our paper, we tried to organize the violence in 3 categories. Pre-election violence. This was usually violence that was happening during political parties' primary elections, where political parties were now choosing the leaders that would stand on their party ticket. And during that time, the female aspirants that were standing faced different forms of violence, from derogatory language used against them, whether it's violence towards undressing or targeting them as a woman. Those were some of the things that were happening around that time. And then during elections, this is targeting the female candidates mostly, but also those that are their supporters. So we've got, I can highlight one incident where there was that lady who was undressed in one of the districts because she was going to a political rally. And then we also had post-election violence. I think there's a context. The last presenter already did talk about that because of the dissatisfaction with the way the elections were conducted. There was a lot of violence, and the kind of violence that we looked at, because we're targeting violence against women in elections, we did identify that there was violence against a police officer, a female police officer. Again, the type of violence, she was beaten and she was undressed. There were male police officers that also experienced violence, but none of them were undressed, which just goes to show that this was very much gendered. And then we've got the women protesters that were also targeted, either women protested or women who were in a relationship with or perceived to be connected to protesters. This is mostly the case of rural Rilongwe, whereby police went in and after having battles with protesters and the police officer was killed, they went in and raped women and assaulted women in their homes. So that was the kind of violence that was there. And through the literature, through the interviews that we did conduct, we came up with several responses that were undertaken. And these responses were undertaken by different categories. They're not ranked or put in order. Mostly it's about whether it was pre-election or post-election or during election. But the kind of responses that were there, for example, before elections was the education and mass awareness raising. So this was taken up mostly by non-government organizations, whereby they used the local radios, private radios mostly, to bring out messages about why there should not be violence, why violence is bad, and just talking about the right to participate. There was also engagement with political parties through, for example, the Women Manifesto movement. They got secretary generals for all political parties and all presidential candidates to sign an undertaking that they would not perpetuate violence, they would accept results, and they would conduct their campaign fairly. So there was a lot of work that was done, and this can be attributed mostly to civil society leaders. We will come back to the leaders, the different categories, but at least on this one, we can say that there's a lot of evidence of this being taken up by civil societies. And then there were also documentation and engagement. So during the actual happenings of violence against women in election incidents, again, for example, there was a civil society organization like Women Lawyers had a situation, a gender situation room, whereby they had lawyers on standby, and these could be accessed by women candidates if they experience anything and they needed legal services. And so they were on standby. They could give them advice, or they could refer them to the right appropriate institutions, or even take up matters that would help. So this was ongoing. It was there. They were recording whatever was happening if they report. Although this did not, on review from literature, from interviews, they did not think it was very successful, because sometimes they were not accessible. So they were supposed to be in a room, and then the women candidates could call in or walk in, but it didn't work as effectively as it was thought to be. But that was one way of documenting and also engaging the justice systems so that the women could be helped when they report violence. Again, there was the solidarity marches or the street protests that came up. there was several protests that were organized mainly by civil society leaders against specific violence that took place. So for instance, we had violence that was perpetrated against the public, and then there were violence that was perpetrated by against, for example, duty bearers like the police officer. For civil society, they organized for both categories. They would organize and speak against it, demand justice, require duty bearers to take up action and the like. And also the members of parliament, especially the leader of Women Caucus, had a one-time protest where they organized across all political parties to speak against violence that had taken place against a member of the public who belonged to one specific party. They had those protests. That was an event for the parliamentarians, but for the civil society leaders, they took that up even beyond that. Not only were they doing protests, but they also took on media engagement. They were naming and shaming, and they had multiple strategies in dealing with that incident. Apart from that, there was media engagement in naming and shaming. So the violence, as I said, there was pre-election, there was during election, and then there was post-election violence. Again, those that stand out are the civil society leaders that continued. Protests were there throughout, but also other strategies, including during the post-elections, the case that was taken to court for the women that were raped during the post-election violence. And as I said, when they're doing the protest, they're demanding from leaders and duty bearers to speak, to act, to stop the type of violence that was there. So those are some of the responses that were there. But now, who were the game changers? I've spoken generally about what they did, but if we look at it, in our study, we had actually identified specific people who were saying the NGOs. And so we have three main civil society leaders. And these are, for example, the Women Lawyers Association, Dalgety Ngcimezile. We have the Executive Director, Maggie Banda, who was representing the Women Manifesto movement. And then there was also Barbara Banda. So these three are the ones that demonstrated consistently taking up every opportunity presented to speak against or to act against violence against women in elections. So their strategies, as I said before, included engaging the media, included mobilizing fellow women and also others into protests. They also did take up matters that went to court or provided legal advice, and they worked together in order to do these things. And so you can see that from our definition of a game changer, who is someone who takes up agency and acts when opportunity presents itself, these acted consistently and over time dealing with the problem. Not only were they naming it, but they were also mobilizing and bringing awareness to it. They were mapping it, its manifestation, and they were also devising strategies. And the strategies that they devised included the protests, included the legal measures, even going to court to seek justice. And so in our research, we did find that these constituted the game changers. As far as the political leaders, as I said, we had the chairperson of the Women's Caucus in Parliament who organized a street protest during when a woman was undressed on her way to Elari. And that was a once-off event. Beyond that, there was no other strategy that was there. And the protest was significant in itself, but over the issues of violence, it did not constitute significance because it was an event, and that was all. It was one-off. It's not something that we can say set up a trend. It's not something that continually spoke against the violence. And then again, on the political leaders, we have the Ministry of Gender, who we had the minister herself, but also the ministry as a whole. So there was a lot of violence that was happening, but the minister, who then belonged to the ruling regime, and which was perceived to be the perpetrator of most of the violence, seemed to be constricted in taking up action. The only time that the ministry and the minister did actually speak out was against the violence that had taken place against a female police officer. So they did write a statement condemning the violence, but other than that, all other violence against the female candidates, against the protesters, they did not speak against it. They did not even support or take up any action that showed that they're pursuing, for example, a remedy or supporting redress or any measures. And so we found that they did not constitute as game changers, the political leaders. Another category was the constitutional bodies. And the constitutional bodies, we highlighted two, the Ombudsman, Martha Chizuma, and then there were 4 commissioners, the Malawi Human Rights Commission. These 4 commissioners, when pre-elections, they had just been appointed, but there was an issue because someone who was not recommended was actually appointed. And so that was, it delayed their starting to work. And so they didn't do much, the commissioners. By the time that they were confirmed and they could start work, it was a little bit late and they did little, but for most of the time, they had not yet been constituted, and so they didn't do as much. However, the ombudsperson or the ombudsman, Martha Chizuma, who was also part of Malawi Human Rights Commission, in her capacity as ombudsman, did a lot, and she's the one who spearheaded, for example, an investigation by Malawi Human Rights Commission into the rape of women in Lilongwe by police officers, and that report led to a case that was taken up by women lawyers that got justice for the women. And so that is well. Throughout, they were available, they were limited in what they could do, and part of their limitation was institutional because of the problems they had. But when there was that opportunity, Martha did do something and take up action and support women. Besides that, they had also opened up for people to come and complain and had reported cases that were referred to necessary bodies. However, perhaps because of the limitations on the institutional and otherwise, they did not significantly do a lot. So in our understanding, the game changers that we found were the civil society leaders, the women leaders in the civil society, because of the consistent and the multiple strategies that they used in naming, in mapping the manifestation of violence, in bringing awareness, but also in devising interventions. For the constitutional bodies, they were constrained by the institutional mechanisms that are in place. They could have been, but they failed because of that. And for the politicians, we found that perhaps the conflict, again, this is from literature, but also the interviews, that their position was compromised because they were subject to their political parties that would then dictate how far and what they can do, but also the self-interest to ensure that they are in a position where they can still continue to stand in that position within a specific party and pursue political office, seemed to have constrained them in making and acting to be game changers. And thank you so much.
No, thank you very much, Ngcimezile. It's been a sobering presentation and a sobering chapter, but with very sharp findings. And I'll encourage the same thing again, those who've been listening just now to the presentation on violence against women in elections. Please, if you have questions specifically about this, put them in the chat and we'll make sure that they get attention later in our webinar. But let me move swiftly on, if I may. I see we're just a little past half time, so we want to be moving ahead. And one of the things we were much concerned to do in the book is to look at recurrent and systemic issues in relation to governance in Malawi. And one of the much discussed issues over many years has been the choice of electoral system, which came to the fore once again in the 2019-2020 period. So we're delighted that Ernest Thindwa was able to contribute a chapter on Malawi's choice of electoral system and reform agenda quandary. Ernest is a lecturer in the Department of Political and Administrative Studies at Chancellor College with an MA in Political Science and a BA in Public Administration, both from the University of Malawi, and also an MBA from the Maastricht School of Management in the Netherlands. Not only does he lecture in political science and management studies, but he's also an ardent governance activist and commentator. And his research interest is in electoral and identity politics. So Ernest, over to you, and I'm grateful if you can squeeze it into 10 minutes at this stage. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, hearing you now, Ernest. You're coming through now.
You can hear me and you can see my presentation.
Yes, we can see the slides and we hear your voice.
Thank you very much. Leading my contribution was Malawi's electoral choice. Malawi's choice of the electoral system and the reform agenda. One thing that I wanted to look at, why did we opt for the first past the post or the simple plurality, which has been contested for so many years? And when we want to reform the same, what exactly do we want to achieve? And that's what motivated me to look at this. And maybe let me provide a bit of context. As I said, the use of first past the post has been contested over the years, which perhaps may be attracted cause for the reform agenda. My concern is, as we engage in the reform process, we are not answering the question exactly what do we want to achieve. 1999, for instance, Gwanda Chakwamba challenged the election of Bakiri Mulozi. It was on the grounds of interpretation of majority. Again, it comes back to the contested use of first past the post. In 2014, after a postmortem study, again, the calls for the reform of the first past the post came into the fore, which led to the tabling of the bill in 2017 to move from simple plurality to absolute majority. Again, it was frustrated by the then ruling party, Democratic Progressive Party. In 2019, again, the issue of first past the post was challenged. Yes, they Saulo Chilima and Lazarus Chakwera, as leaders of the opposition, challenged Mutharika on the suspected electoral fraud, but there was also an issue of legitimacy on the basis, again, of the use of plurality. And the chapter is concentrating on the legitimacy question. And the key questions I'm trying to answer are, why did we opt for the first past the post in the first place? And why do we want to reform? The second issue I was looking at was, how has the first past the post affected the political legitimacy of the successful regimes we have had since 1994, when we moved from one-party system to multi-party system? And I'm again trying to understand who are the drivers of the electoral reforms and what are their motivations. And lastly, I'm looking at what are the prospects for the reform agenda and their implications. I am arguing that our choice of the first past the post was not a conscious effort. Ideally, when you are choosing an electoral system, you want to look at how that electoral system will affect the party system, which has an effect in terms of collective political behavior, particularly in a country like Malawi, which is a young democracy and multi-ethnic. An electoral system is key in terms of political stability and national building. Unfortunately, my analysis suggests when we are looking at our electoral system, we don't pay attention in terms of how are they affecting the political party system, particularly the political party system functions. When you look at electoral literature, it's very clear that electoral system do affect the party system functions, particularly in democratizing society like Malawi, which is multi-ethnic. And it is important that we pay attention to how the electoral system will affect the party system functions and how those functions will affect collective political behavior. These are the issues. That is the argument I am raising to say we are not our choice of ladder, first past the post, was not a conscious effort, was essentially adopting that which was imposed on us by our colonial masters. We did not pay much attention to see how the first past the post will affect our political stability. We simply adopted what the British imposed on us as our former colonial masters. And as we engage in our reforms, again, we are not looking at how these reforms will affect the party system functions. And that is a concern of this chapter. If we are to look at the rationale, of course, why we opted for the first past the post, the analysis shows that we simply adopted what the British sold to us. And Malawi was not the only country. Indeed, if you look at all former British colonies, they adopted the same simple plurality. You look at Botswana, Gambia, Ghana, Lesotho, Swaziland, Tanzania, all these countries simply adopted what the colonial administration had imposed on them. And that has had implications because collective political behavior has been shaped in such a manner that political stability is under threat. Coming to how the first past the post has affected the regime legitimacy in Malawi, there are a few issues that are coming out, which we need to pay attention to as we engage into the reform agenda. One thing that the first past the post has done is that we have had regimes that have had narrow mandates, and the margin of victory over the years has been declining, meaning it is raising a question of legitimacy. For instance, in 1994, the winner then, Bakili Muluzi, had to win with 47%. As of 2014, the winner, Peter Mutharika, had the 34%. So he came into power with 34% only. If you look at the trend has been declining margin of victory and narrow mandate. And this may explain the increasing tensions and indeed scale of violence. As Martin said in his presentation, you see violence. Now, if you're looking at electoral violence, for instance, especially against electoral results, over the years, there's been increase in terms of scale and intensity. And one may say that there is a correlation between the victory of margin and the scale of intensity. And this has to do with the electoral system we are using. One other thing that the system has done is to heighten ethnic or regional consciousness. And this is creating tension and threatening political stability. The other thing that the first past the post has done is to make one region to dominate politics, From 1994 to 2014 rather, elections were won by political parties whose political base were in the South. Now we need to understand that here in Malawi, political competition is not so much about political parties. Political competition is about ethnic and regional political groupings. Political parties are merely used as vehicles. The real competition is between regions and ethnic groups. So a win or a loss will mean a region or an ethnic group winning or losing. And that tends to generate a feeling of exclusivity, to the extent that 6 rounds of elections produced a president from the South, which is the most populous, generated sentiments of being excluded in the North and in the South. The reason you see increasing ethnic-based or regional-based tension, if you look at the electoral violence against electoral results, they have been much intense in the South, in the North and the center, not so much in the South, giving you an idea that our electoral system has created a situation where regions, ethnic groups are competing, and the loss of one party suggests loss of one region or ethnic group. And that is the challenge that we are trying to deal with. Now, all these are some of the challenges that might have motivated those that are pushing for electoral reforms. Because if you look at declining narrow mandate, political mobilization based on regions, dominance of one region in politics, and ethnic original based tension, it is raising questions of legitimacy. And these are the issues those that are pushing for the electoral reforms are citing. I have tried to look at the various actors in the electoral reforms and their motivations, but in the interest of time, we can proceed. But what is key here is that the electoral reform has so many actors. These actors have different strengths and constraints. One key issue is the issue of veto power in the reform process. All other actors other than the political parties do not have voting rights and veto powers. That is making electoral reforms to be challenging, particularly if those reforms are not accepted by the political class. This is what this section
Ernest,
is
just one sec. Just thank you for thinking about time. Maybe if you could take about another 2 minutes, that would be great.
Great. So in terms of prospects, I am saying prospects for the reform aren't looking good. If you look at the reform that are being proposed by the those that are pushing for reforms, there are many, but I am skeptical if they'll pass it through, simply because most of them are threatening the political class. And where the political class is threatened, it hasn't shown a willingness to accept reforms. Various reform bills have been defeated. We have moved from first past the post to absolute majority for the presidency, but we have maintained first past the post for parliamentary elections, giving you an idea that politicians will only accept those reforms that do not threaten them. In terms of conclusion, I am concluding that the choice of first past the post did not take care of the need to look at how electoral system will affect how parties will mobilize the electorate. And the parties' mobilization of the electorates along ethnic and regional lines will continue because the current electoral system does incentivize them to do so. In terms of implication, I think one implication I want to highlight here is the need to split veto powers in the electoral process. What I see is that veto powers are monopolized by a political interest or political parties other players do not have. To the extent that only political parties have veto powers, the reform that we desire may not come through until such a time when veto powers are spread. And I am suggesting that perhaps we need the Law Commission to be constitutionally empowered to recommend reforms and only rejected or changed in the legislature with the acceptance of the Law Commission. That is what I can say about the presentation.
Thank you so much, Ernest, and thank you for being so succinct. And I guess you've given a lot of food for thought. Maybe many of us, when we realized that Malawi had moved to 50+1, we thought, oh, that's the end of discussing about the election system. But I think you've shown us this discussion is far from finished and is still going to be with us. So let me encourage again those who would like to respond to Ernest's presentation with a question or a comment. Please take advantage of the chat function. I can see it's been working in the earlier presentation. But without any delay, I'd like to come to our Scottish respondent, Susan Dalgety. Susan has been active in public life in Scotland for many years as a journalist and also in political life and government, both at municipal and national level. So she's got a huge experience to bring to the kind of issues that we've been discussing. But probably also a very relevant bit of experience is that somehow or other Malawi cast its spell over Susan. So she keeps coming back to the extent that last year she published her first book on Malawi. It's called The Spirit of Malawi. Very sympathetic and insightful account of what life is like in Malawi today. It's published by Lewis Press in Edinburgh, available here in Blantyre at the Central Bookshop and other outlets, and I can certainly recommend it. But Susan, can we hand to you to offer us your thoughts on all that you've heard and read from these chapters that are in view today?
Yes, Ken, thanks very much for the introduction. Hello, everybody. First of all, I'd just like to say congratulations to everyone who's contributed to the book Beyond Impunity. I'm really looking forward to buying a copy, the Malawi edition, because it's slightly cheaper than the one that's currently available once the Malawi one is ready. I think it's a really important book because it covering the development of democracy and accountable institutions in Malawi, setting out the significant progress since 1994, and of course highlighting some of the challenges that lie ahead. As Ken suggested, I've been involved with a range of practical governance initiatives in Malawi since 2005, when I first visited to set up the visit by the then First Minister Lord Jack McConnell. I've spent a lot of time in Malawi since, learning more each visit about what makes Malawi's governance work and what doesn't. Perhaps not surprisingly, it's the same issues that make Scotland's governance work or not. And I've made some very good friends, particularly Maggie Banda, Chief Executive of the Women's Legal Resources Centre, based its headquarters in Blantyre. And I've been privileged to work with many other wonderful people, including Professor Chiweza. For the last 7 years, Maggie Banda and I have been working on a governance programme for councillors in Malawi, 10 districts and 1 urban, Mzuzu. And as a former councillor in Edinburgh, it was a very real pleasure to get to know so many of Malawi's councillors. And as Ken says, I've also written a book about Malawi, which made me think much more deeply than perhaps I had previously about the country. And I was privileged to interview people from Vice President Chilima to a traditional midwife in Zomba district. I've learnt many things in the last 20 years, and perhaps the most important lesson is that good governance, wherever it is a work in progress. It never finishes, whether in Lilongwe or Edinburgh. Good governance is central to development, to social culture and cultural and economic progress, and every country needs a strong legal system, robust institutions, well-resourced and professional media houses, and trusted civil society organisations. And every country needs governments, national and local, that are not corrupt, and where the politicians and the civil service understand that they are the servants of the people, not our masters. As Martin says in his chapter, citizens also need to trust the democratic process. Otherwise, they will be reluctant to pay taxes to a government they don't believe is legitimate. And without enough tax revenue, no government can develop its country properly. I have to also agree wholeheartedly with Ngcimezele's assertion that women leaders are game changers. I was particularly inspired by my colleague Maggie Banda's work in the Women's Manifesto movement prior to the 2019-2020 presidential elections. Though perhaps we sometimes risk putting too much faith that all women politicians will be better than their peers. We've had a woman leader in Scotland for nearly 8 years now, and the UK has had 2 women prime ministers. Each one has had her weaknesses as well as her strengths. Politicians will be politicians after all. But I want to focus now on getting more women into Parliament, and crucially for me, but I think for good governance everywhere, into local government. Because the one thing I know for certain, that is governments must reflect the society they serve. And all societies are made up of about 51% women and 49% men. 5 years after the introduction of multi-party democracy in Malawi, Scotland underwent its own political revolution with the establishment of the Scottish Parliament. Ernest might be interested to learn that it has proportional representation electoral system instead of a first past the post one, as Westminster has. Scotland remains part of the UK, but most domestic policies, health, education, transport, etc. are decided in Scotland, not at Westminster. When the new Parliament was set up in 1999, the biggest party in Scotland was Labour, and it made a deliberate decision to put forward 50-50 candidates in winnable seats, a game-changing move as it turned out. Because thanks to Labour, the first Scottish Parliament had 48 women MSPs out of 129, 37%. To put the results in some context, more women were elected to the Scottish Parliament in one day than had been elected to represent Scotland in the House of Commons since 1918. Women's representation in the Scottish Parliament has gone down and then back up in the years since, and today we have 58 women MSPs, 45%, nearly 50%. A woman is First Minister and her cabinet, like the Malawi one, is 50-50. But that progress is dependent totally on the will of political parties to choose more women in winnable seats. Now let's look at local government. We have 32 councils in Scotland, Malawi has 35. In 2019, only 19% of the councillors elected in Malawi were women. 5 years ago in Scotland, we did slightly better, but not much. Women made up 30% of local government councillors. And in a few weeks' time, on 5th of May, in Scotland, we will hold local government elections, and I am not at all hopeful that we will increase women's representation beyond 30%. This is shameful in 2022. Local councils, whether Mzuzu or Glasgow, deliver vital services. They are the strand of government closest to the people. Go into any community setting in Malawi or Scotland and you will find a majority of women. But go into any council chamber where the local power and resources sit and you will find a majority of men. This must change, and it cannot be left to the political parties to decide for themselves if and when they will introduce equality. Both Malawi and Scotland would benefit hugely if gender quotas for both Parliament and local government were introduced by law, forcing political parties to be more representative. Gender quotas work well across Europe, in Ireland, Denmark, Spain. They work well in sub-Saharan Africa, as Professor Chiweza shows in her chapter. Quotas do not discriminate against men, as some suggest, but what they do is provide a legal framework to end patriarchal traditions in politics. Electing more women into Parliament and into councils will not transform our countries and our communities overnight, but it would make our democratic institutions much more representative, and that can only be a good thing. As I said earlier, good governance is a work in progress, and for me, 50-50 men and women is the next stage. So I'm hopeful that over the next decade, both the Scottish Parliament and the Malawi National Assembly will deliver legislation to introduce mandatory gender quotas. As we continue on our democratic journey side by side, we have much to learn from each other, and I look forward to continue campaigning with my sisters in Malawi and Scotland to achieve equality of representation. Ndizigomo.
Thank you so much, Susan. Amazing coverage of the range of issues that we've discussed today, and I think just bringing home to us how much, even thousands of miles apart and with so many differences, governance, when we come to governance, it's many of the same things that we're struggling with at either end of this partnership. Given our format today and our limited time, I think what I'd like to do in our remaining few minutes is to give an opportunity to each of the presenters. Some of you have had some response to your presentations in the chat, and I can see you've been coming back in the chat, but if there's any last word you would like to have as we draw towards a close, we'll just go through in the order of the presentations. So Martin and Ngcime, Ernest, and back to Susan. And if not, it's no problem, but if there's one final word that you'd like to share with the group, it's very welcome. So can I turn back, first of all, to Martin Mwale?
All right, thank you very much, Prof. I think the issues which were there for me to qualify, we have tried to address them through the chat box. But otherwise, just thank you and thank you everybody for being here to listen to this wonderful kind of work from different presenters at the same time. I think this was something interesting for the first time happening this way. Thanks.
All right, thank you. I think there was one comment and one question, specifically asking that I only looked or only presented or paper only presented on women game changers. I must say that was the focus of our paper. We deliberately looked at women leaders and tried to identify women leaders and what they did. So it was very much deliberate. It's not necessarily about women versus men, but we are all advocates of gender equality and specifically of women's rights. And that's why we chose to focus on women leaders. But also in the paper, we justify that there's a lot of research that says women leaders are more likely than men to take up women causes. And that's why we chose women leaders. Thank you.
Yeah, for me, I think it's just an appeal for those colleagues that are working on the electoral reforms. I think the reform agenda, in my view, has not been informed by a scholarship. I think it is clear that when we are choosing or reforming electoral systems, it's important we look at how they will affect the political actors in terms of how they mobilize their electorates, the current, I think, the legal framework, electoral framework, does not really give political party incentives to make sure that they don't mobilize along regional or ethnic dimensions, but they go for what you would call social aggregation. That's not being done essentially because the current electoral system does not provide incentives for political parties to go much broader than their traditional stronghold, which will always continue to affect the legitimacy of any regime. Thank you.
I'll be very brief. I really just want to say that democracy is not easy, but Malawi's progress since 1994, 28 short years, has been quite remarkable. And that's thanks in no small part to the rigorous the thinking that happens at Chancellor and elsewhere. So I think, as I finished off my speech earlier, I think we have a lot to learn from each other, and we should, I hope we continue this journey together.
Good. Well, thank you very much, Susan. I think you've captured the spirit of the book, if I can coin a phrase, because what we sought to do was to give that kind of recognition. You're talking about the way the Malawian people handled the challenges of 2019 and 2020 showed an enviable democratic maturity, but at the same time, the book is not in any way complacent or triumphalist. It's recognizing that there are very significant challenges that have been perennial. They keep coming up, and they seem to be somehow built into the system. And I think some of those have been exposed in the presentations today. And we hope very much that that is a contribution to the Academy for ongoing work in analysis of governance and politics, but we hope it can do more than that. It can be a contribution to the country, and we'll be seeking in coming weeks to give a profile to the book to that end. Thank you to all the participants. I'm sorry that we could not hear more voices, but the chat function has been great, and I believe that the hosting SMP have a way of capturing what's in the chat. It has been a valuable discussion there, and perhaps as I hand over to David to round off, he can say something about that as well as other things in concluding our webinar. Thank you.
Thanks ever so much. Thanks, Ken, and on behalf of everyone in the Scotland-Malawi Partnership, thank you to all of our excellent speakers, to Martin Mwale, to Dr. Mweso, to Ernest, Thindwa, and Susan Dalgety as our Scottish respondent, albeit from France. Thanks also for the questions and the good discussions in the chat box. And just as Ken said, yeah, absolutely. What we can do is we can publish that. It's all on one webpage, the webpage that you use to book your place here today. You can look at all of the past webinars, you can watch the videos, and you can see the chat box. And that chat box discussion thread, I think, was particularly rich in today's meeting. Ken started the afternoon by showing the fresh off the print Malawi edition of the book. So I'm keen to, in the spirit of partnership and reciprocity, plug and show off the UK version that's print on demand and that is available now online, but the cheaper Malawi print run to follow in Malawi, perhaps at our next gathering. We're going to revert back to Wednesdays next month, so it'll be the last Wednesday of April, and that'll be our penultimate session, Wednesday the 27th of April, sticking with the same time of 2 p.m. In the UK and 3 p.m. in Malawi. It's the second in our panel discussions, and to get you excited about that, there's three main themes that we're looking at next month: opposition in multi-party Malawi, security sector governance in Malawi, and executive supremacy and the power of the armed forces. Important issues indeed. We're going to hear from Associate Professor Asiati Chiweza, from Dr. John Luanda, as well as George Luanda, Mr. Raphael Mwanda, Dan Kuwali, and Mapatso Piri, as well as a Scottish respondent who we haven't yet announced, but look forward to doing so. Craig, if you are happy enough to put the poll up on the screen, if we've got that ready to go, just two quick questions, and I think that's everything from me. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you again to our speakers, and I really hope you can join us in April, that last Wednesday in April. It's always a pleasure. It's a highlight at the end of the month for me to listen to colleagues in Malawi talking about governance. It's such an important theme. Thanks for joining us, and do put the final 2 dates in your diary. Thank you.